Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about your role as a paraprofessional. If you've been assigned as a paraprofessional, there's a number of ways that you might be assigned. It could be that you're one-on-one with a student. You could be a paraprofessional in a special education classroom. Sometimes you are a paraprofessional in a classroom where kids are integrated into the general education classroom. Sometimes we have small groups, large groups. There's all different ways that paraprofessionals can be assigned to kids. But I want to talk a little bit about what that role looks like for you so that you have a better idea of how to support the student or students that you're working with. So one of the things that I think is a really big piece is the communication with teachers. One thing that I've always been really adamant about is that I'll have paraprofessionals that I meet and they say, oh, I'm just the paraprofessional. And I always stop people. No, you're not just the paraprofessional. You are the paraprofessional. Oftentimes with these kids, you're the direct contact with that child. And so you know them better than anybody. You may have questions about what you can do and what you can't do with a particular student, but you also might have some ideas. You may go to a training, you may read something. And so I think that communication between the teacher is really important. And so, in order to have that conversation, you need to be able to be open-minded. You need to be able to go in and say, hey, I've got an idea. And I know sometimes it feels like, okay, but she's the certified teacher, so she knows better than me. It's all about the way that you communicate. If you're able to say, hey, I'm really excited about this year and I just wanted to know if there's anything that I can do differently. I have an idea. You probably know better than I do if it would work or not, but could we talk about some ideas that I have? You put it out there so that you're not saying I know better than you do, and the teacher wouldn't want to do that anyway, but you would look at collaborating together. How can you collaborate? How can you communicate? If something's bothering you, people don't know that unless you communicate it, and communicating it to somebody else doesn't make things change. And so that's what you want. You want to love your job. You want to come every day. You want to work with these kids. You want to be able to make a difference. That's probably why you got into this field, or you're working towards becoming a teacher. So communication is key. If something doesn't make sense to you, if you have a question about something, if you want to understand your role better. I know sometimes, like being in the general education classroom, it's like, okay, am I supposed to tell the kid what to do, or is the teacher supposed to tell the kid what to do? I don't know the answer to that. The only way you're going to find out is to communicate. You talk to the teacher. Do you want me to prompt? Do you want to prompt first and I'll prompt second? Do you want me to step back a little bit? I mean, anytime we have a paraprofessional with a student or a group of students, we want to think about kind of working you out of a job. Not that you wouldn't have a job, you'd go somewhere else, obviously, but the idea is that kids as adults, when they become adults, they don't have paraprofessionals with them anymore. So we want to work on being able to fade our support. Does that look like maybe right now I'm standing right next to the child, but maybe by Christmas I'm standing here and I'm a little bit further away? Or maybe I'm giving a lot of prompts, but now I want the general education teacher to be the one to give the prompts, and I'll only give a prompt if I need to after they're not responding. So, again, I think it's the communication that's going to be such an important piece to understand what your role is. And a lot of times people don't know. Even the teachers may not know exactly what that role looks like. And so you really need to sit down and talk about that so that you can come up with the best plan for the child. And again, if you have concerns or problems, or you feel like you're not doing something right, or you're not really sure how to modify a worksheet or those kinds of things, speak up about that and talk to your team so that you can work out the best plan for the child. Supporting in the general education classroom really does look a lot of different ways, and we've talked about this a little bit, but for some kids, they're in the general education classroom and they're doing everything that the other kids are doing. And that's one way a child can integrate into that classroom. Maybe they're doing all the same worksheets and all the same lessons, and you're there to support them in case there's a question or behavior. Sometimes kids are doing all of the same work, but it's modified, right? So like they have a spelling test to do with 20 words, but the student that you're with only does a spelling test with 5 words. And so that might be a way that child is integrated into the general education classroom. And again, that's where you're going to have to communicate with the teacher. Who's modifying that? Are you picking the 5 words, or is the teacher picking the 5 words? I've been in a lot of situations where the teacher just says, let the paraprofessional do it, but maybe you're not really sure. You guys need to have those kinds of conversations so you can figure out, okay, if this student needs it modified, is it okay for me to write for them or not? Like, does the teacher want a grade where they're writing on their own, or is it okay for me to write for them? those are some things that you can discuss. I've also had kids in the general education classroom who are not doing the same thing. They basically, the IEP team decided that they wanted that child to be integrated with their peers, but academically they're nowhere near their peers. So they're doing a completely different curriculum. So maybe all of the kids are doing addition with regrouping and math, and this particular student is working with you on counting. And that is another way that that child can be supported in the general education classroom as well. So again, you need to come up with who's coming up with those alternative activities. If they can't do paper pencil stuff and you're working on counting, who's coming up with that? Is that something that you're able to come up with? Is that with some guidance from the special education teacher, the general education teacher? All of those things need to be communicated so that everybody's on the same page, and it makes for a really, really good support and program for kids. The other thing is just a little bit for you to understand the IEP. IEP is an individualized education plan. And so if you're new as a paraprofessional, that might be something that's new to you. What that is basically we look at the criteria to give somebody the eligibility criteria for a disability. It could be autism, it could be an intellectual disability, someone that's visually impaired, any of those things. And what the IEP team does first is they talk about the strengths and weaknesses of the child. So in other words, how does that disability affect that child? And that's a team conversation with the IEP team. So we're talking about how does it affect their math? How does it affect their social skills? How does it affect their behavior, their health, their vision, any of those things? And after looking at all those strengths and weaknesses, which has to be done first, then the team comes up with goals and objectives to work on those weaknesses. So you can't come up with goals first. You have to talk about the strengths and the weaknesses first. Then the team comes up with goals. So you may be given an IEP or part of an IEP, and you may think, where did these goals come from? Well, they came from that IEP meeting where the team looked at strengths and weaknesses. Now, a lot of times paraprofessionals are not part of the actual meeting. You guys are still working with the kids and making sure that everything happens the way it should on a day-to-day basis. But certainly feel free to share, like, this is an area of weakness that I'm seeing, like he's able to do this, but processing this part can be very difficult. But those goals and objectives are the things that the team has decided that we would work on with that child and take data on them for an entire year. An IEP is for 1 year, and every year annually it needs to be renewed. And those things can also, or the IEP also includes a list of accommodations and modifications. So the team decides, is this a student that we can write for them? What about like things during MAP testing or whatever your state testing is? Is that something where they can have that in a small group? Can you read it to them? Or when tests are available, is it something that someone can read the test to them, or can we rephrase it? So that's the piece that's going to be really, really important for you to know, because that's the part that's going to make sure that we're following the IEP. The IEP is a federal document, and so we have to follow what the team decides. And so if you haven't seen the IEP, you may not need to see the whole IEP, but you need to make sure that you're getting those accommodations and modifications, because those are the pieces that you're going to be responsible, especially if you're working with one-on-one with the student. So like we had an IEP and the student came and we were looking at the IEP, and probably took us a couple days to really like get to know the student, and we're looking at it, and then somebody says, oh, he's supposed to have a snack every morning. Oops, didn't catch that. That's because we weren't paying close enough attention to that IEP. It's a very, very important document. You have to review that first. If you're assigned a kid, say, hey, can I see the IEP? Can I see what those modifications are, so we can make sure those things are in place? The IEP team put that together as a way for that child to be successful. So you want to make sure that those pieces are there. Now, sometimes school districts, don't necessarily give you the whole IEP. That's fine. They might give you a summary, but you really want to make sure you know what those accommodations and modifications are. The other thing is, how do you make those accommodations and modifications? So let's say it says shortened assignments, or maybe it says that you should do something called chunking. What does all of that mean, and how can you modify? So a lot of times what I tell people is that kids will maybe get overwhelmed when there's a lot of work. So maybe what the other third graders are doing is a whole worksheet with like 20 problems on it, and you give that to the child with a developmental disability, autism, or an emotional disorder, and they're gonna look, no way, this is way too much work. So anything that you can do with chunking, shortening it, and that doesn't necessarily mean that they don't eventually have to do all of it. So like I've taken a piece of paper that had 4 rows of math problems and I fold the paper so the only thing I'm showing them is 1 row of math problems. And they do that row and then we maybe take a quick little break, maybe not away from the table, maybe we're still sitting at the table and we're talking and we're taking a deep breath, or maybe we can doodle something on a piece of paper, whatever, and then I'm going to flip it and we're going to do the next row. So yes, do they have to do all of the work? Probably so. Maybe their modifications in their IEP says that they only do half of it, but always feel free, especially with some guidance with the special education teacher, the general education teacher, the team, to modify things in a way that helps kids be successful. Because ultimately, if you have a kid that's refusing, you got nothing done. If you have a child that you can modify and get some of it done and build on that, then you're going to be more successful. So shorten task, chunking. I know writing for them can oftentimes be a really good way of helping a child lower their frustration. But again, that's something where you want to find out, is that something that's an okay modification to do in the IEP? There also might be other ways that the child can write, like maybe they can write on a computer keyboard if they're typing their spelling words, or doing something on the iPad or a Chromebook. So what are some ways that you can modify? And then the last piece is really understanding under this area of accommodations and modifications is how to prompt. So there's a number of ways that we prompt kids to get a correct answer. And in one of the ways we do that, we look at, like, basically maybe we ask the child a question and they don't get it, so we give them a little bit of help. And then maybe when they don't get that, maybe we get them a little bit more. So we're basically like kind of slowly adding prompts one at a time until they finally are successful. So an example, maybe you say to the child, okay, hon, what's 2 plus 2? And you wait and they don't answer. So then maybe you try to give a little prompt. You don't want to give them the answer yet, but you give them a little prompt like, okay, remember we worked on these addition facts yesterday. Think about your 2s. And they still don't answer. So then now, okay, still don't want to give them the answer, but I want to give them a little bit more help. Like, okay, count with me, 2, 3, and then you might say for them to fill in 4. And so what that's called is least to most prompting. We give the least amount of help, add a little bit at a time until we're giving the most amount of help so the child can be successful. That is a good way of assessing how well kids have learned things that have been taught. But if we want to teach a new skill, really the research says we should flip-flop that. We should actually give the most amount of help in the beginning and fade that until the child is independent, and that's known as errorless teaching. It's helping kids do the tasks without making any errors. So if I'm teaching this for the first time, I might say, okay, what's 2 plus 2? Let's count 2, 3, 4. That's right, you got that one, it's 4. Okay, let's think about your 2s. Let's try the next one. Let's 2 plus 1, 2, and then maybe they fill that in. So each time I'm kind of backing off a little bit, and that way they're getting the answer right away. You can reinforce them right away by saying good job. Think about the first way that I said what's 2 plus 2 and you wait. And then what's 2 plus 2 and you wait, and you keep giving a little bit of prompting. How long does it take before you can finally say, hey, that's right, that's a good job? If it takes that long, they're not getting that reinforcement quick enough. The errorless approach is where you're helping them right away, giving them that reinforcement, and then backing off and fading that as they start to show more independence. The reason why I think this is also a good component is that when we talked about in the executive function skills webinar, if you have been through that yet or not, there's an area of executive function skills that has to do with initiate, which is like getting started on something. So kids that you say, here's some math and they don't want to get started. I think sometimes that becomes difficult if you say, for example, here's some math, let me know if you need help. Well, if you have a student with executive function skill deficits that don't know how to get started, that's going to be really hard to initiate. Versus if I sit down and say, okay, here's some math. Let's look at this together. The first one is 2 plus 2. That's 4. Easy. Go ahead and put that one down. So yes, I practically give them the answer, but guess what? They picked up their pencil. They started doing the task. Now they've initiated and they're on track. So think about using that prompting style or that teaching style in order to help kids. Now you don't want to do so much for them that you're not working on fading those prompts. You don't want kids to be prompt dependent, that they can't do anything unless you're there to prompt them. So you have to think about that. You have to think about how to back off a little bit at a time so that you can help kids become independent.